Some are calling them the new oil of the world economy. These minerals and metals are essential for producing new technologies like microchips, electric cars, and solar panels. And governments are scrambling to secure them. China is using its market dominance to weaken its rivals. US President Donald Trump has invoked wartime powers to boost production and has even threatened to seize mineral-rich Canada and Greenland. But where is the European Union in the global race for raw materials? We break it down in EU Decoded.
The EU has listed 34 critical raw materials it considers essential. 17 are prioritized as strategic. They include cobalt, lithium, manganese and nickel, used in electric vehicles, and gallium, copper and silicon metal, used in solar panels. The Critical Raw Materials Act sets targets for the EU to extract 10%, process 40%, and recycle 25% of the strategic materials it consumes by the end of this decade.
Part of the EU strategy means mining, but also refining and recycling more raw materials at home in Europe. The European Commission recently selected 47 new strategic projects in 13 EU countries. But how do Europeans feel about the prospect of mining returning to their backyards?
Unabhängigkeit finde ich nicht verkehrt, wenn man an Betracht halt der Abhängigkeit, jetzt ist ja, glaube ich, auch gerade das Thema mit den Abhängigkeiten von chinesischen Erden und so.
Ja, ich befürchte, dass das Bergrecht so gestaltet wird, dass die Gemeinden wenig Einspruchsrecht haben bzw. Mitspracherecht. Und ich meine, Brüssel ist weit weg von irgendeiner kleinen Posemuckel-Gemeinde.
Also ich meine, es hört sich danach an, dass vielleicht Arbeitsplätze geschaffen werden können, was gut ist.
C'è il fatto che ci sono i cinesi che fanno come gli pare, per cui, ma anche gli stessi americani, poi non parliamo dell'Africa, dei cinesi in Africa, per cui io dico che secondo me smettiamo di farlo perché c'è qualcuno che si sporca le mani per il nostro conto.
Io sono d'accordo, però comunque servirebbe una forte campagna di informazione anche da un punto di vista meramente scientifico.
Robert Hodgson is our senior energy and environment reporter, and he's been following the Critical Raw Materials Act for Euronews. Robert, thank you for joining us. First, can you tell us why there's such a rush here in Brussels to both mine more at home, but also to diversify Europe's mineral suppliers?
Two reasons. First of all, demand for these minerals is rising because they're needed for the energy transition. Modern technology and now weapons is becoming a more significant factor. The other problem that Europe has is that over years they've developed dependencies on other countries for the supply of these things, that not much is produced in Europe.
Brussels also is looking further afield. It's been running this diplomatic campaign to strike agreements with various third countries. They say these are like-minded third countries. Is this campaign to strike these deals working?
Well, the diplomatic offensive began in 2021 with the signing of a memorandum of understanding with Canada, which I suppose you can quite happily call like-minded. And it's also a powerhouse of minerals production. They've followed with several others. The next one was Ukraine, and that was signed just 6 months before the Russian invasion. Since then, they've built up the number of these MOUs to 14. And they have other countries, including Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's becoming more evident that there's a problem around the sort of moral questions around whether we should be doing business with a certain country. Rwanda has come into focus recently because the Rwandan military has been supporting rebel groups in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's been credible reports from the UN and NGOs that minerals are being smuggled across the border into Rwanda and then exported to Europe. And these are sort of known as conflict minerals. You can see the same moral questions arising in Ukraine because the EU has its memorandum signed with Ukraine, but at the same time, the Trump administration has been pushing Ukraine to sign a deal with the US in exchange for continued military support, where they want access, essentially open access to all of the Ukraine's mineral wealth.
13 EU countries have been selected for new raw materials projects. But domestic measures aren't enough. The EU has also struck partnerships on minerals with 14 world countries, including Australia, Chile, and the DRC. This is to reduce dependencies. For example, the EU relies on China for 100% of its rare earths, Turkey for 98% of boron, and South Africa for 71% of platinum.
Joining me now to delve a little bit deeper into the Critical Raw Materials Act is Eduardo Righetti, who is a researcher in energy, resources and climate change at the CEPS think tank here in Brussels. The Critical Raw Materials Act was conceived to kind of support and underpin the European Green Deal, but now we're seeing a push to rearm Europe. Does this mean also that the Act is becoming even more critical and strategic for the EU?
Yeah, it is true that the aerospace and defense sectors also heavily depend on critical materials, applications such as aircrafts or vessels and ammunition, as well as satellites and other space applications, all require materials like rare earths, graphite, cobalt, and others.
One of the goals of the Act is to actually increase the amount of critical raw materials that the EU recycles by the end of this decade. If this is a possibility and an attractive route for the EU, why are we not doing more of this, the recycling, already?
For most of these materials, recycling rates are still relatively low, and this is because from one side, we do not have enough technologies that have reached the end of life yet, but at the same time, it's due to other more structural issues related to, for instance, technical issues with recycling, as well as the cost of recycling.
Given that there is a potential trade war heating up between the two biggest world economies right now, do you think the EU needs to consider other policy options to address its vulnerability when it comes to sourcing raw materials?
Now, there are several elements within the Act that go in that direction, from the improvement of risk monitoring efforts, including through stress testing, but also the requirements for large companies using these materials. Now, all these elements, together with other medium to long-term strategies, such as setting up partnerships with resource-rich countries, can help mitigate supply risks. But at the same time, of course, we know there's no one single silver bullet, and even setting up these systems will take time, especially in the EU.
In an energy transition and a global arms race, the demand for minerals will only increase, but competition is aggressive and could revive historic inequalities. Trump is demanding access to Greenland, Canada and Ukraine's mineral wealth. In places like Myanmar and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the mineral rush continues to drive conflict. The European Union still says it's counting on a secure and sustainable supply.